So today we'll be talking about a new type of threat actor that we've seen on multiple Dart engagements and the business decisions that have led to their successes. We will touch on some Dart story time, along with tactical and long-term remediations that organizations can leverage to protect against these types of attacks. First, we'll start off with some intros. So my name is Stella Agakyan. I've been a consultant on Dart for about almost 2 years now. Primary role is as a forensic analyst and threat hunter, but I also have some involvement with training development and help facilitate Dart's general hunter training for all of our new hires.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Livingston. I'm also a consultant on the detection and response team. Been on the team for about 3 years, primarily working as a forensic analyst on our incident response engagements. But I've also had the wonderful opportunity of getting to work with our Dart interns on research and development efforts and on training content development. So at Dart, our overall mission is to respond to security incidents and help our customers become cyber resilient. We have a handful of different offerings, both in the proactive and reactive space. And all of the case studies today that Stella and I are planning on going over fall into the incident response or reactive category. Every incident response engagement that Dart has is unique, and it's dependent on a variety of factors. One of the main ones is at what stage of the threat actor activity the customer was able to detect that activity occurring in their environment. Was it at the beginning stages of initial access, or had the actor already obtained their actions on objectives? These, upon many additional investigative questions we ask ourselves in regards to how that initial access was obtained and persistence mechanisms that may have been established, for example, we depend on data in order to derive answers for. Because of this, we're dependent on the current state that the data is in upon starting our investigations, as well as the scope that that data is available in order for us to analyze that data effectively. Overall, this data not only provides us insight into the incident at hand, but also gives us insight into the tactical and long-term mitigation steps that we will take with our customers and provide recommendations for. Although all incident response engagements that Dart engages on are unique in nature, our tooling and methodology continues to be the same for each one. Since Dart is needing to understand as much of the scope of the incident as possible, the tools and data sources that we rely on provide a historical, point-in-time, and active monitoring component. To supplement any data sources that may be available for us, Dart has a custom tool set to provide insight into the historical and point-in-time data. We utilize a variety of tools such as ASAP Inventory, Fennec, and Life in order to gather an initial triage of forensic data across the Windows and Linux environments for our customers. It is then with that initial triage data that we identify particular systems of interest and run an additional tool called FOX, or Forensic Extractor, to collect even more forensic evidence from that system for deeper analysis. We then utilize a tool called Arctic in order to gain insight into the Active Directory configuration for each of the customer domains and identify key points for tactical and long-term mitigation based off of that configuration. For the continuous monitoring component, we'll rely on the Microsoft Security Stack, which includes but is not limited to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, Microsoft Defender for Identity, and Microsoft Defender for Cloud App Security. Dart also has a great relationship with Microsoft's threat intelligence team, Mystic, of which we, through that collaboration, get to utilize their observables based off of common attacker techniques and find additional insight into how we can continue to pivot through our customer data sets to gain even more information off of that threat actor's tactics. It is with all of these data sources and more that we work to educate the customer on the incident at hand, as well as opportunities for attacker containment if the threat actor continues to be in the environment, and provide recommendations for long-term improvements for more positive security posture.
So over the past year, DART has conducted numerous investigations into a new class of extortion and largely malwareless threat actor. These threat actors are not sophisticated in the techniques that they're using and have adopted a back-to-the-basics methodology to gain initial access and cause organizational damage. Their destructive nature has been tied to a motive for fame. In other words, they're extremely proud of the actions they're able to take against their victim organizations, especially by also highlighting the security flaws that let them gain access and achieve their objectives in the first place. So taking a look at the business decisions that have actually led to these successes, we see that most of them are centered around a lack of fundamental security controls and zero trust methodology. We see that many organizations don't take zero trust seriously until after an incident has already occurred. A common sentiment with that is nothing bad has happened, so why should we spend the money to implement zero trust? Another factor in the hesitation to adopt zero trust is the expense and the potential disruptions to business that would come with that, such as reducing access to accounts and having to educate users in new security practices and protocols. Instead, organizations prioritize cloud migration instead because they see that as still moving forward with important security measures, but they might actually unintentionally introduce additional risk instead. Because organizations see the cloud as inherently more secure than on-prem, we've noticed that organizations migrate to cloud services much faster than their security model can actually sustain, so they're left with an inherently insecure tenant instead. And with the migration to cloud services, you need to make sure that you've configured them properly to ensure adequate segmentation between the cloud and on-prem environments. So a basic security control that you should be implementing but is often forgotten is keeping cloud admins in the cloud and on-prem admins on-prem. And due to that lack of security control, we're increasingly seeing threat actors pivot from the cloud to on-prem or vice versa. And that's reflected in DART engagements as well, where you saw the offerings Kate went over. We had IR and O365 IR, but we're increasingly seeing incidents that span across both the customer's on-premises and cloud environment, so we adapt the way that we do our work. One of the attack vectors to the cloud that we see quite often is the exposure of remote access services. With your assets accessible from the internet, threat actors will exploit them to gain initial access and move further into your environment. Another factor is that if you don't have those additional security measures in place, and you don't have additional protocols like VPN, they're able to gain that initial access even faster and with a higher likelihood of success. So reducing the exposure of remote access services is a good way to protect your assets from initial access. But as a similar measure, you should be implementing multi-factor authentication, or MFA, to help protect accounts from initial access. So we do acknowledge that the implementation of MFA isn't a be-all, end-all solution that's going to totally eliminate the risk of a threat actor gaining access to one of your accounts, but it does provide an additional barrier to them doing so. And with the implementation of MFA, the way that you're accepting MFA is also something that you need to consider. So if you only have the simple approve or deny prompt, threat actors know that they can get users to accept prompts that they did not generate, especially if they're sending large quantities of those in a very short period of time. Another thing that we often see with MFA is that organizations do have overarching policies in place to require MFA for all users, but then they put in additional policies that exclude users authenticating from the internal network, for example, in an attempt for convenience. But you're not actually reducing your exposed attack surface by doing that, and it doesn't really constitute a substantive method of implementing MFA. Also, in an effort for convenience, many organizations lifted or never implemented requirements for device enrollment with the shift to remote work. So hybrid work arrangements like bring your own device or BYOD that were implemented during the pandemic actually contributed to the rise of this new class of threat actor activity. Additionally, it's kind of infected investigations at all because you can no longer consider authentications from unmanaged devices as automatically malicious. So the ability to forensically identify login activity of interest becomes just a bit more difficult. But as you can see with all of these different business decisions, they really are centered around the fundamentals of security. And in the coming case studies, Kate and I will actually dive a little bit deeper and see how those incidents actually occurred.
Wonderful. In our first case study today, we had a customer in the entertainment industry that had been impacted by a destructive actor. Before we go into the details of the timeline, I would like to provide you all just with an executive summary of what we had observed as part of our investigation. The actor had gained initial access through a technique called session token replay, and upon achieving initial access, had actually modified the multi-factor authentication settings for that compromised account to register their own personal device to accept future MFA prompts. After having established this form of persistence, they proceeded to move laterally to other systems within the environment, gathering as much information as they had access to, which contained information regarding their source code repositories, as well as their virtual machine provisioning service. Utilizing that available information, they proceeded to clone all of those code repositories as a form of data exfiltration and deleted over 500 virtual machines within the customer's infrastructure. Upon deletion of all of those virtual machines, the customer had understood that a threat actor had performed this activity, and it was at that stage that they had engaged DART for an investigation. So a lot of our focus was around what information had they had access to in order to perform all of these actions on objectives, and was there any other activity that they had done outside of this initial impact that had also occurred. Starting at the beginning of the timeline, we were tracking for a lot of anomalous logon behaviors, such as uncommon source IPs or any behaviors that could be tied to session token replay. A common means of stealing these session tokens actually occurs through phishing emails. So the user will click on a link within a phishing email and be prompted to enter their credentials on a convincing fake logon page. And after having done so, the fake logon page will actually interact with the legitimate one in order to send a MFA prompt to the user for them to accept. Upon accepting that MFA request, upon it returning to the legitimate site, the actor will actually intercept that information from the acceptance in order to steal that session token to be replayed for future use. It is once they had obtained this session token through an attack vector called adversary in the middle attack, we identified 3 additional accounts of interest, as well as our left goal post, or what is also known as the earliest successful actor activity that we had observed according to this incident. Once they had logged in using user 2 in this case study, they proceeded to modify the MFA settings for that particular account. We utilized the unified audit log to identify the timestamp at which these MFA settings had been modified, what actually had been modified within those settings, and in this case, we're actually able to see the new registered device that they had used in order to perform that second factor, as well as the source IP from which those modifications had occurred from. Not having yet obtained connectivity to the VPN, they wanted to have a better understanding of what resources they already had access to, just based off of these initial compromised accounts, and proceeded to perform reconnaissance of those resources. This unfortunately involved their instruction manual on how to connect to the VPN, and they proceeded with the steps in order to connect their own personal device. We were able to identify the documents that the threat actor was able to obtain through that compromised account, utilizing Microsoft Defender for Cloud App Security, since it logs the documents that were triaged by the compromised account through SharePoint and OneDrive. Since the customer had a bring your own device or BYOD policy, this activity was not initially seen as suspicious at the time, given that this workflow was consistent with that of their normal users. We then utilized VPN logs to identify the various timeframes of which they had logged in from that previously identified source IP and the assigned internal IPs that had been used during that timeframe, which allowed us to have a better understanding of the other assets that they then logged into once having connected to the VPN. After having obtained VPN connectivity, they continued with their reconnaissance efforts, now having this level of access, and that included instructions for their virtual machine provisioning service. With the instructions on how to provision their own VMs, they actually proceeded with doing so themselves and utilized those as a jump box, so to speak, to gain even more access to additional assets. Unfortunately, the logs for this VM provisioning service had not been backed up, and the data retention on them was rather small, so we didn't get a lot of insight into the activity that had occurred on those systems in particular. But thankfully, Microsoft Defender for Cloud App Security actually logged not only the account that had initiated that VM provisioning service, but the timestamp of which that had started, and the name of the virtual machine that had been provisioned. So we were able to utilize that information to figure out what systems it had logged into throughout the rest of the environment through logon event IDs moving forward. Now having access to these additional assets, they continue to do all of these logins from those virtual machines, and that included access to their code repositories. So it was at this stage that they proceeded with cloning over 400 source code repositories that they had access to. Typically, this tends to be the end of a threat actor narrative, as data exfiltration is a very common motive for a lot of threat actors. But these destructive threat actors tend to take it one step further. They utilize open source tooling, and in this case had utilized a tool called Impacket to perform remote code execution against the systems that they had access to through those virtual machines that they had provisioned. We were able to identify this through the event logs on those targeted systems through process creation IDs. Similarly, they attempted to download a tool called ADFind, which provides insight into Active Directory configuration, but due to company policy, the download actually failed at this stage. Along the way, they continued to compromise additional accounts. We were not able to identify how they compromised the service account for the VM provisioning service, but based off of the logon behaviors for that account, we were able to tie it in with this threat actor activity. And with this, they continued with their reconnaissance efforts and had the level of access they needed in order to perform extreme action against the virtual machine infrastructure. It was at this stage they performed their last successful action within the customer environment, which involved deleting over 500 virtual machines within their infrastructure. It is through techniques such as session token replay, MFA setting modification, and Impacket that the threat actor was able to perform this data exfiltration and mass destruction of infrastructure in under 24 hours. In other cases, such as the one that Stella will go over next, tactical mitigation efforts were able to be put in place prior to potential destructive actions being taken.
Thanks, Kate. So with case study 2, we have a large customer in the technology industry that was compromised by a destructive threat actor. We'll go over the timeline of events for this case study as Kate just did for case study 1, but in summary, the actor socially engineered an employee into accepting an MFA prompt and proceeded to enroll their own device. So having gained initial access and having registered their own device as a means of persistence, they then utilized various open source tooling to perform credential theft. As Kate alluded to, a big difference between this case study and case study 1 is that the threat actor was unable to accomplish their goals in this case. The customer was able to detect this attack more early on than they did with case study 1, and were able to implement fundamental tactical mitigation efforts before engaging DART, and we helped them with further mitigation efforts that successfully prevented any other successful threat actor activity. So taking a look at the timeline, the first event, as we just spoke about, is that successful MFA prompt and the subsequent enrollment of a threat actor-controlled device. They were able to gain access to that account because they flooded users with large, very large amounts of MFA prompts and then used phone calls and email to socially engineer them into accepting one of them. Those types of techniques where users are inundated with MFA requests until they accept one is called MFA fatigue, and it's not unique to the destructive threat actor group. We see it quite often with both destructive and non-destructive actors. But as you can see, this does kind of mirror the left goalpost in case study 1, where they also gained initial access and then immediately enrolled their own device. Moving along in our timeline, the threat actor then logged into hundreds of devices from a threat actor-controlled device. This type of discovery is conducted so that they can gain more knowledge about the internal network and infrastructure. During this activity and continuing on through the rest of the attack lifecycle, the threat actor utilized multiple different threat actor devices to access the various compromised users. We were able to utilize VPN logs provided to us by the customer to determine which exact threat actor device by IP was accessing which user account during a given time frame. So basically, we knew threat actor device A was accessing this user account on these dates, and the device 2 was accessing these user accounts on these 2 days. And that was really invaluable in helping us differentiate between legitimate activity and malicious activity, given the accounts they were using were legitimate user accounts that had just been compromised. The next event in our time frame includes the creation and execution of various open source cred theft tools in an attempt to dump credentials. With the data that was available to us, we were unable to determine what exact credentials, if any, may have been in these dumps, but we do know that these tools were executed. Also within this time frame, although not written out on the slide, the threat actor was also deleting various event logs and also put in place sticky keys backdoors on these machines. If you're unfamiliar with what a sticky keys backdoor is, you're essentially replacing legitimate accessibility binaries with command.exe. One of those accessibility binaries, and the one that was replaced in this case, is sethc.exe. So when you replace sethc.exe with command.exe, essentially the threat actor can hit shift 5 times, and instead of being given any accessibility functionality, they get a system level or privileged command prompt, and they can run commands that way, totally bypassing the logon screen entirely. Moving on, we have data staging and exfiltration. So the domain administrator password was changed by the threat actor, and they subsequently used that account to extract ntds.dit. And then we saw outbound network traffic of about 20 gigs to a threat actor-controlled device, which was indicative of ntds.dit leaving the customer's administrative control and entering that unauthorized environment, which would be the threat actor-controlled device. We were able to utilize event logs and firewall logs to identify this activity. And if you're unfamiliar with ntds.dit, it's an Active Directory database that's highly targeted by threat actors because it does contain, among other information, all of the password hashes, which they can then utilize. Moving on, we see destructive malware targeting backup servers and Cobalt Strike separately executed and quarantined by AV. Though this was quarantined, it's important to call out in our timeline because the use of the destructive malware does show that this ties in with the destructive nature of this threat actor group. This was also the activity that initially notified the customer that something abnormal was going on in their environment, and they proceeded to use their internal security teams to begin investigation. And as we'll see a bit further down in this timeline, they did start tactical remediation efforts the next day. However, the next step that we see here, they extract ntds.dit again on a second DC in a different domain. However, in this case, there was no indication in firewall logs that they ever exfiltrated ntds.dit from this specific machine. Moving along, the next day, we have Mimikatz executed against 12 systems from an actor-controlled device, again, in an attempt for dumping credentials. In this case, the threat actor largely leveraged PsExec, legitimate binary that's from sysinternals, to remotely execute Mimikatz against these devices. They also create another persistence mechanism through the creation of scheduled tasks on multiple servers. So the purpose of this scheduled task was to execute a binary named a.bat, which would then communicate with the threat actor's command and control infrastructure. Those single-letter file names we often see used by threat actors, so it's a good quick win IOC to look for on any Dart engagement. And we were able to use the customer's event logs to identify this behavior because all scheduled task activity of interest to us is logged in the event log. Moving on, this is the last activity before tactical remediation starts, but it's not the last threat actor activity on our timeline. The threat actor RDP'd into one of their compromised user accounts and proceeded to use that account for discovery in order to browse files and directories on multiple servers. Then you have, on the same day, tactical remediation efforts starting. The purpose of tactical remediation was to address persistence mechanisms for any known threat actor activity. They also identified, patched, and further hardened their tier 0 assets, along with creating new temporary domain admin accounts that the threat actor would not have access to. While tactical remediation was ongoing, the threat actor was also still active within this environment, and potentially in response to these mitigation efforts, their activity shifted to be solely focused on credential theft. So we see Mimikatz and AD find executed against one server from a threat actor-controlled device. Additionally, they dropped another batch script on disk. The purpose of that script was to take all of the AD find output, so it was a couple different text files, put them into an archive, and then delete the text files, AD find, and itself, leaving only the archive on disk. We couldn't recover that archive in order to see what exactly may have been in the text files, nor did we see any firewall logging to indicate they exfiltrated the archive, but we do know that it was created because we did recover that batch script and see the actual contents of it to see what it was doing. And the last two steps on our timeline constitute much of the same activity. So we see Mimikatz and in-packet secrets dump executed against multiple servers from a threat actor device. Secrets dump is part of the in-packet suite, so a successful execution of secrets dump itself would give you output akin to extracting ntds.dit and the system registry hive from a DC. And the next day, we again see in-packet secrets dump was executed and AD find on multiple servers from an actor-controlled device. We did spend some time discussing this activity as analysts because we did find it a bit odd that they were running secrets dump on so many devices in the same domain that they had already extracted and exfiltrated ntds.dit from. It's possible that maybe they thought it would give them new information given tactical remediation was ongoing, but it just goes to show that as analysts, we can only speak to what the data itself is telling us. Threat actor motive is something that's much more difficult to determine. But nevertheless, this was the last successful threat actor activity, which not so coincidentally aligned with the end of tactical mitigation efforts. And I say successful threat actor activity because we did observe the threat actor attempting to regain control of this environment again, but they were never able to get back in. But the purpose of this case study, as compared to the first, is to show you that tactical remediation can and will help prevent further threat actor activity. But taking a look at the two case studies side by side, we had high fidelity that both of these case studies were impacted by the same exact threat actor group. So we ask ourselves, why is it that case study 1 had that impact that was so much more severe than case study 2? So looking at case study 1, we see it's a smash and grab attack, occurred under 24 hours, and the customer was only alerted to this attack after VM deletion had already occurred. That was due to the fact that their EDR was not monitored effectively, and they didn't have any monitoring capabilities around their VM provisioner or their code repositories. Case study 2 was more of a pre-ransom cred theft attack. It occurred within a couple weeks, And this customer actually did have active monitoring and multiple investigative teams per division of the organization. So essentially, the comparison boils down to three main points: that the attack against customer 1 occurred much more rapidly than the attack against customer 2. Customer 1 only detected this and engaged DART after impact had already occurred. So while we could help them regain positive control of their environment, the VMs had already been deleted and the threat actor had already accomplished their goals. And customer 2 had more resources immediately available to them, which includes not only the fact that they had the multiple investigative teams, where customer 1 only had one small internal team, but also the fact that customer 2 had centralized logging available, which gave them more insight into the entire attack lifecycle. Whereas, as Kate said, with customer 1, the logs for the VM provisioner got deleted and they were not backed up anywhere. As you can see, the most important key part of case study 2 were the tactical remediation efforts. So I will pass it along to Kate to tell us more about what tactical and long-term remediation actually entails.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stella. So in both case study 1 and case study 2, policies had already been in place in order to allow for users to remotely access their environment, and it unfortunately allowed threat actors to do the same. That's why in this case, the tactical mitigation steps that you'll see here mirror directly to what had set the stage for the actors in the first place. We understand that adopting a zero-trust methodology and implementing a tiering model can take time and resources. But in order to have effective attacker containment and avoid further privilege escalation, we want to find quick ways that we can reduce this attack surface. This is why in this case we perform an audit of the Active Directory configuration for customer domains to identify quick wins to not only avoid further privilege escalation, but regain positive control of the environment. We also want to stop any additional initial access vectors that may be available for the threat actor that's currently present to obtain once these tactical mitigations are put in place, or other threat actor groups alike. It's not uncommon for DART to observe multiple threat actor groups within a single environment, having either used the same initial access vector or other ones that had been present. A couple that we'll go over here that are common additional initial access vectors are public-facing assets as well as unpatched systems. Public-facing assets and services such as remote desktop protocol introduce a high level of risk for environments, regardless if it provides a nice means of users to gain access. It's in this case that we then advise implementing a remote access VPN solution with the additional barrier of multi-factor authentication. For unpatched systems, we'll want to not only identify what has been unpatched at the operating system level, but also at the application level, as unpatched systems introduce many different vulnerabilities that can be exploited for initial access and for other attacker techniques. It is at this stage that not only are we wanting to implement additional solutions, but prioritize active monitoring. It can be difficult to identify anomalous actor behaviors just through source IPs alone, as there's a variety of different factors that we need to take into account, such as business travel, that will allow for a high volume of false positive alerts and potentially generate alert fatigue for defenders. It's because of this, and wanting to ensure that devices that are touching the environment are in a healthy state, that we recommend implementing a device management and enrollment solution such as Intune. Now for long-term remediation strategy, or for aspects that are going to take some more time and resources, there are a lot of factors that can go into this category to not only continue to maintain positive control of the environment, but also improve upon the security posture moving forward. But today we'll focus on just a few key ones, specifically in terms of ensuring that we have a best understanding of how MFA has been implemented within your environment, as well as how threat actor activity can be identified quickly and often. For MFA implementation, we'll want to ensure that there is an additional level of validation that users have to provide when accepting MFA prompts. Features such as number matching or prompting the user to input a number that is available to them after they've entered their credentials is a great way to ensure that users are verifying that they themselves are the ones that had initiated that MFA prompt. This helps to mitigate against attacker techniques such as MFA fatigue that Stella had gone over previously, as well as social engineering efforts that we had seen in case study 2. We want to ensure that your MFA solution is appropriately logging from which source IPs the MFA prompts are originating from, as well as if there was an approve or rejection for that particular MFA request. This enables defenders with the information they need in order to identify the left goalpost or earliest successful actor activity for any incidents they may be investigating. Logging in general is going to equip your defenders with the information they need to have as much information possible regarding threat actor behaviors that may be occurring within your environment. Two key things to keep in mind with your logging are not only going to be having it centralized, as previously mentioned, but ensuring that that data has appropriate data retention policies in place so we have the scope that we need to continue with our investigation and gain as much insight into the entirety of the life cycle of that attack. Microsoft has a lot of great documentation in terms of audit policy recommendations that can be referenced in the future if you are curious to learn more. It is also at this stage that we're going to want to establish or reestablish a tiering model in order to avoid future privilege escalation by unauthorized accounts and users, as well as unauthorized access of assets, especially at the tier 0 layer. All of these long-term remediation efforts are not only applicable to on-premises environments, but the cloud as well. As Stella had previously mentioned, we're going to want to keep this in mind, in particular to administrative accounts, and ensure that they are separate between on-premises and cloud environments. Resources are available both for the tiering model as well as best practices for Active Directory as well for continued future reference. All of this can be done in advance of an incident and does not only protect you against destructive threat actors, but all threat actors alike, as a lot of the techniques that we have gone over today are commonly used.
So to tie this all together, we want to reiterate that the reason we were going over the basics of security controls is because these threat actors are also employing the back to the basics methodology that we had discussed. One of the reasons that we see organizations don't already have the basics in place is because there's a propensity for orgs to focus on those elaborate and complex attacks that make headlines, but in doing so, they often forget those basic security controls. And you should never underestimate a less sophisticated threat actor because, as we saw in case study 1 that Kate went over, the impact can still be extremely severe. So if you're trying to protect against elaborate attacks without first having all of your bases covered at the fundamental level, you're always going to have vital gaps in your overall security. And as we saw with case study 2 and the tactical mitigation efforts that the customer implemented along with Dart, the implementation of those basic security controls did prevent any further threat actor activity, so we were able to demonstrate that it does work. You might ask yourself, what are some core actions that organizations should take? Most importantly, you need to make sure that you have a solid inventory of all of your assets because you can't protect what you don't know you have. Ensure continuous patching of the operating systems and underlying software, like Kate said, and make sure that you have implemented a comprehensive centralized logging solution with a well-defined retention policy. As members of Dart, we get really excited to see that these policies are already in place when we're engaged because it ensures that your security team has the resources that they need to detect and prevent these attacks. And as Kate said, we're basically at the mercy of the data that's available to us. So if you, for example, don't have a centralized logging solution and the threat actor comes in and nukes all of your logging, it's going to be really difficult to get a full picture of what happened. And we understand that there's time and resources to consider when implementing solutions like this. It doesn't just happen overnight. But just as you're considering the time and the resource that you'll need to implement these solutions, threat actors are also considering the cheapest and most effective means that they can use to gain initial access into your environment. So if they can do so with unsophisticated techniques and open source tooling and still evade detection, they absolutely will. So this boils down to the fact that you need to make sure you have those fundamentals in place so that you can make the threat actor's life as difficult as possible so they can't use the back to the basics methodology that these threat actors have been using in the investigations that we've seen. So with that, I want to thank you guys for attending our presentation. And if you're interested in learning more about DART and our research, you can visit aka.ms/dartblogs, where we have a lot of great content on the work that our team does.
Thank you.
Exit.